Sarah Miller had always been a woman who found joy in life's simple pleasures. In the small farming community of Willowbrook, nestled in the rolling hills of rural Pennsylvania, she had built a life that nourished her soul. Each morning she would rise with the sun, the aroma of coffee brewing in the kitchen, mingling with the scent of dew on freshly cut grass. Her husband Thomas worked as a delivery driver for the local hardware store, while she ran a small vegetable stand at the farmer's market and crafted handmade quilts that had become sought after throughout the county. Their modest two-bedroom farmhouse sat on 3 acres of land that Sarah had transformed into a vibrant tapestry of vegetable gardens, fruit trees, and wildflower patches. Her pride and joy was the jasmine vine that climbed the trellis by their front porch, its sweet fragrance greeting visitors before they even reached the door. Their 10-year-old daughter, Emily, spent her afternoons helping in the garden or playing in the small creek that cut through the back of their property, her laughter floating through the air like music. "Mama, look what I found," Emily would often call out, presenting some treasure, a uniquely shaped stone, a bird's feather, or a wildflower bouquet, as if offering the most precious gift in the world. "That's beautiful, sweetheart," Sarah would reply, her heart full. In those moments, watching her daughter's eyes sparkle with excitement over nature's simple wonders, Sarah knew with absolute certainty that she had everything she could ever want. Thomas was a good man, hard-working and reliable, though he occasionally dreamed of something more. One day, he would say, looking out at the horizon from their front porch, "We'll have a bigger place. Maybe I'll start my own business." But there was no urgency in his words, just the gentle musings of a man content with his lot, but open to life's possibilities. Their evenings were spent together on the porch swing, watching fireflies dance across the yard, while Emily chased them with breathless delight. Neighbors would sometimes stop by, bringing homemade preserves or freshly baked pies, and conversations would flow easily, centered around community events, the changing seasons, and plans for the upcoming harvest festival. "Oh, you make the best strawberry preserves in the county, Sarah," Mrs. Jenkins from down the road would say. "You really ought to sell them at your stand." Sarah would smile, appreciating the compliment, but never feeling the need to expand beyond what she already had. Her small business provided enough to supplement Thomas's income, and their needs were modest. They had no debt, a roof over their heads, food on their table, and most importantly, they had each other. "We're blessed," she would often say to Thomas as they lay in bed, the moonlight casting silver shadows across their quilt. "I wouldn't trade what we have for all the riches in the world." Little did she know how soon those words would be tested. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, bearing an official seal and a return address from a law firm in Philadelphia. Sarah was pruning her tomato plants when the mail carrier's truck pulled up. "Something important looking for you folks today," said Joe, the mail carrier who had been delivering to their route for over 20 years. He handed her the envelope with a curious look. "Not often we see something from Blackwell, Montgomery and Associates around these parts." Sarah wiped her hands on her gardening apron and took the envelope, her brow furrowing slightly. "Thank you, Joe, probably just some mix-up." But as she opened the letter at the kitchen table, her hands began to tremble. According to the elegant typeface on the heavy cream paper, Thomas's Uncle Richard, a man they had met only twice at family reunions, had passed away and named Thomas as his primary beneficiary. The inheritance was substantial, a luxury condominium in downtown Philadelphia, a portfolio of investments, and a considerable sum of money. There was, however, a condition. The will stipulated that to receive the inheritance, Thomas would need to complete a college degree within 3 years. Uncle Richard, who had built his fortune from nothing after putting himself through college, believed strongly in the value of higher education. Sarah sat at the table for a long time after reading the letter, watching the sunlight shift across the wooden floorboards as the afternoon wore on. When Thomas's truck pulled into the driveway that evening, she was still sitting there, the letter spread out before her. "What's this?" Thomas asked, picking up the letter after greeting her with a kiss. His eyes widened as he read, and then, "Read again," as if the words might change upon second inspection. "This can't be real," he finally said, looking up at Sarah with disbelief. Uncle Richard was wealthy, sure, but this is life-changing money. Sarah nodded, her throat tight. It is. We could have. Everything we've ever wanted, Thomas continued, his voice gaining excitement. A bigger house, a college fund for Emily, retirement security. I could start that business I've been talking about. We'd have to move to Philadelphia, Sarah said quietly. You'd have to go to college. Thomas paced the kitchen, energy radiating from him in waves. I've always regretted not going. This is like a second chance, Sarah, don't you see? It's Providence. Sarah looked out the window at her garden, at the land she had nurtured for years, at the community that had embraced them. But we have everything we need here, she said softly. Thomas knelt beside her chair, taking her hands in his. His eyes were alight with possibilities. Think about Emily's future, the opportunities she could have in the city, the best schools, cultural experiences, connections that could open doors we can't even imagine. Sarah thought of Emily, of the educational possibilities that would be available to her in Philadelphia. She thought of Thomas, who had given up his own dreams of college to support his family when his father fell ill years ago. Let's sleep. On it, she suggested, but she could already see the decision forming in Thomas's eyes. That night, as Thomas slept soundly beside her, dreams of their new life presumably filling his mind, Sarah lay awake. Outside their open window, crickets chirped their nightly symphony, and the jasmine's scent wafted in on the gentle breeze. She wondered if the air in Philadelphia would smell of jasmine, or if it would carry the sense of concrete, exhaust, and unfamiliarity. It's just a place, she whispered to herself in the darkness. Home is where we're together. But even as she formed the thought, a sense of foreboding settled in her chest, heavy as stone. Change was coming, a tidal wave of it, and Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that once it swept over them, nothing would ever be the same again. The Philadelphia skyline loomed before them as Thomas navigated their packed SUV through the busy downtown traffic. Emily pressed her face against the window, eyes wide with wonder at the towering buildings that seemed to touch the clouds. Sarah sat quietly in the passenger seat, a small potted jasmine plant cradled in her lap, the only living piece of Willowbrook she had brought with them. There it is, Thomas announced, pointing to an elegant high-rise with a glass facade that reflected the autumn sun. Riverside Towers, our new home. The transition had happened with dizzying speed. Within 2 months of receiving the letter, their farmhouse had been sold. Thomas had enrolled at the University of Pennsylvania for the spring semester, and they had packed up their life in Willowbrook. The tearful goodbyes with neighbors who had become like family still echoed in Sarah's heart. Mrs. Miller. The concierge greeted them in the marble-floored lobby, his crisp uniform and formal tone immediately making Sarah conscious of her simple cotton dress and worn cardigan. We've been expecting you. Welcome to Riverside Towers. Their inheritance included a 3-bedroom condominium on the 22nd floor with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered panoramic views of the city and the Delaware River. The interior was already furnished with sleek modern pieces that felt cold and impersonal to Sarah's touch. It's like something from a magazine, Thomas breathed, running his hand along the granite countertop in the kitchen that was 3 times the size of their old one. Can you believe this is ours? Emily disappeared down the hallway, opening doors and letting out excited squeals when she discovered her bedroom, complete with a canopy bed and a desk that housed a brand new computer. It's beautiful, Sarah agreed, though the words felt hollow in her mouth. She placed her jasmine plant on the windowsill in the living room, its small green presence dwarfed by the vastness of the Philadelphia skyline beyond. The first few weeks were a whirlwind of adjustments. Thomas threw himself into his studies with unexpected vigor, seemingly rejuvenated by the academic environment. He quickly made friends with classmates, most of them much younger, but a few were adult learners like himself. Sarah noticed how easily he slipped into this new world, adopting its language, its customs, its aspirations. Sarah, meanwhile, struggled to find her footing. The farmers' markets in Philadelphia were sophisticated affairs, not the casual, community-centered gatherings she was used to. When she inquired about setting up a stand, the market manager looked at her homemade quilts and preserves with thinly veiled disdain. "We tend to feature artisanal products with more contemporary appeal," the woman explained, her eyes flicking over Sarah's simple attire. "Perhaps you'd like to take one of our marketing workshops first?" Emily, at least, seemed to be thriving. Her new school offered opportunities that Willowbrook could never have. Provided advanced classes, a robotics club, field trips to museums and cultural centers. She came home each day bubbling with stories and new knowledge. Sarah was grateful for this, even as she felt her daughter slipping into a world she herself did not fully understand. As weeks turned to months, the distance between Sarah and Thomas grew in ways that had nothing to do with physical proximity. Thomas was rarely home, his days filled with classes and study groups that stretched into evenings spent networking at university events. When he was home, he was distracted, his mind clearly elsewhere. "There's a gala at the dean's house this weekend," he announced one evening, scrolling through his phone as Sarah prepared dinner, a task that had once been a point of connection but now felt like a solitary chore. "We should go shopping for something appropriate." Sarah looked down at the simple meal she was preparing, suddenly conscious of how plain it was compared to the restaurants Thomas had begun frequenting with his new friends. "What's wrong with what I have?" Thomas looked up, noticing her for what felt like the first time in days. His expression softened slightly. "Nothing's wrong with what you have for every day, Sarah, but this is different. These are important people, professors, alumni, potential business connections. First impressions matter." Sarah felt a flicker of hurt. "And you think I'd make a bad impression?" "That's not what I meant," Thomas sighed, running a hand through his hair, which was now styled in a way that made him look like a stranger to her sometimes. "It's just things are different here. I'm trying to build a future for us, for Emily. Can't you try to meet me halfway?" So she tried. She went shopping at stores where the price tags made her wince, purchased a dress that cost more than a month's worth of groceries back in Willowbrook, and allowed a stylist to cut her long hair into a sleek bob that the woman assured her was much more now. The gala was a blur of unfamiliar faces, complicated conversations, and the constant feeling that she was playing a part in someone else's play without having been given the script. Thomas moved through the crowd with surprising ease, discussing economic theories and investment strategies as if he'd been doing it his entire life instead of just a few months. "And what do you do, Mrs. Miller?" the dean's wife asked when they were finally introduced, her smile polite but her eyes evaluating. Sarah hesitated, suddenly aware that "I grow vegetables and make quilts" would sound quaint at best, pitiful at worst in this setting. "I'm exploring new opportunities now that we've moved to the city," she finished lamely. "How flexible of you," the woman replied with a tight smile before turning her attention to someone more interesting. Later that night, as Thomas chatted animatedly about the connections he'd made and the opportunities that were opening up, Sarah stood at the window of their condominium, looking out at the city lights that sparkled like distant cold stars. Her jasmine plant had begun to wilt despite her careful attention. "I think it needs more sunlight," she murmured, more to herself than to Thomas. "What?" Thomas asked, pausing his story about a potential internship. "The jasmine. It's dying." Thomas came to stand beside her, looking not at the plant but at the view. "We could get another one, or maybe something that thrives better in city apartments, a succulent maybe." Sarah turned to look at him, really look at him, and felt a chill run through her. Who was this man in designer clothes with carefully styled hair and a vocabulary peppered with terms like networking and market potential? Where was the Thomas who used to sit with her on their porch, dreaming simple dreams and finding contentment in what they had? "It's not about the plant," she said quietly. Thomas's phone buzzed, and he glanced at it, already distracted again. "I've got to take this," he said, stepping away. "It's Professor Harrington. He mentioned a research assistant position that would be perfect for me." As Sarah watched him walk away, his voice shifting into the confident, polished tone he now used with his university associates, she felt a profound sense of loss. The jasmine might yet survive with more care and the right conditions, but she was beginning to wonder if the same could be said for their marriage. Over the next several months, the transformation continued. Thomas rarely attended Emily's school, events always citing coursework or networking opportunities. He began to criticize Sarah's cooking, too simple, her opinions outdated, her reluctance to engage with his new circle of friends, embarrassing. The final straw came on a rainy Tuesday evening. Emily was at a school science competition that Thomas had promised to attend but had cancelled at the last minute for a study group. Sarah was alone in the apartment, trying to salvage her jasmine plant when Thomas returned home unexpectedly early, accompanied by a woman Sarah recognized from his economics class, Vanessa, with her perfect blowout and designer suit. "Sarah, you remember Vanessa," Thomas said casually. "We're going to use the dining room to prep for tomorrow's presentation, if that's okay." "Of course," Sarah replied automatically, though the dining room table was set for the family dinner she had planned to surprise him with. As she retreated to the kitchen, she overheard Vanessa's muffled comment. "She's so quaint, like something out of a Hallmark movie." Thomas's response was even worse. Not a defense, but a low chuckle and words that cut Sarah to the core. "We're not exactly from the same world anymore." The change in Thomas was no longer subtle. It was as if the wealth had unlocked something in him, a desire, perhaps a need, to prove he belonged in this world of privilege. Their conversations, once filled with shared dreams and gentle teasing, had become transactions, schedules to coordinate, social events to attend, Emily's activities to manage. Even those grew increasingly rare as Thomas spent more time away from home. One evening, Sarah waited up for him, determined to bridge the growing chasm between them. It was nearly midnight when the elevator chimed, announcing his arrival. She could smell the expensive cologne he'd started wearing, mingled with the scent of whiskey, as he stumbled slightly, dropping his keys on the marble entryway floor. "Where have you been, Thomas?" she asked, her voice steady despite the knot in her stomach. "Emily's science fair was tonight, you promised." He looked at her, his expression a mixture of annoyance and dismissal. "Some of us were celebrating. Professor Harrington offered me a position as his research assistant. It's a big deal, Sarah. So was Emily's project. She won first place." Sarah crossed her arms. "She looked for you in the audience the whole time. She'll understand when she's older." Thomas loosened his tie. "This is about building our future. Her future." "By missing her present," Sarah challenged. "She's growing up without you, Thomas." "I'm living here without you." He sighed dramatically as if she were being unreasonable. "I'm doing this for us, Sarah. Why can't you see that? Why can't you adapt like Emily has? Even my 10-year-old daughter understands the opportunities here better than you do." The words stung. "And what opportunities have I had exactly? I've tried to find my place here, but—" "Have you?" he interrupted. "Have you really tried? Or have you just been waiting for things to magically become like Willowbrook again?" He gestured around the luxurious apartment. "This is our life now. These are our opportunities. But you're still acting like the small-town farmer's wife, and frankly, it's becoming embarrassing." Sarah took a step back, physically recoiling from his words. "Embarrassing?" "Yes, embarrassing." His voice rose. "Do you know what it's like trying to introduce you to colleagues? You don't know how to talk about anything relevant. You don't understand the social dynamics. You wear Target dresses to cocktail parties." "I've been trying to support you," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper, "to give you space to build this new life you wanted so badly." "Support?" Thomas laughed, a harsh sound she'd never heard from him before. "Support would be becoming someone I can proudly have by my side in this world, not someone I have to explain or apologize for." Sarah felt as if she'd been slapped. "Is that how you see me now, as someone to apologize for?" Thomas ran a hand through his hair, his frustration evident. "Look, I didn't mean it like that. I'm tired and I've had a few drinks. Let's just talk about this tomorrow." But Sarah couldn't let it go, not this time. "No, I think you meant exactly what you said. I think you've been thinking it for months. Ever since we came here, you've been becoming someone else, someone who values status and appearances over substance and connection." "That's not fair," Thomas protested, but his eyes shifted away from hers. I'm just trying to make the most of this opportunity." "At what cost?" Sarah pressed. "Your family? Your values? The man I married would never have missed his daughters. Science fair for a networking event. Maybe the man you married was holding himself back," Thomas snapped. "Maybe he had ambitions and potential that were being stifled in that backwater town. Maybe he's finally becoming who he was meant to be." The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah looked at the stranger before her. The tailored suit, the expensive watch, the carefully cultivated appearance of success, and felt a profound sense of loss. "And maybe," she finally said, her voice steady despite the tears threatening to spill, "the woman you married isn't meant to be part of that picture." Thomas's expression hardened. "Maybe she's not." 3 words. Just 3. Simple words, but they crystallized months of growing distance and disregard. Sarah turned away, unable to look at him anymore, and walked to their bedroom. She began gathering her things methodically, placing them in the same suitcase they'd brought from Willowbrook less than a year ago. Thomas followed her, leaning against the doorframe. "What are you doing?" "What does it look like?" Sarah continued packing. "Don't be dramatic, Sarah. Where would you even go?" "I don't know," she admitted, "but I know I can't stay here pretending everything is fine when it's clearly not." Thomas's expression shifted from dismissive to angry. "And what about Emily? You just take her away from her school, her friends, the opportunities she's finally getting." Sarah paused, her hands hovering over a half-folded sweater. Emily was flourishing here in ways she never could have in Willowbrook. The thought of disrupting that made her heart ache. "I would never force Emily to leave if she's happy," she said carefully. "But I won't stay where I'm not wanted or respected." Thomas's laugh was bitter. "So you'd abandon your daughter too? Perfect. The devoted mother walking away when things get difficult." "That's not what..." "Isn't it?" He stepped closer, his posture intimidating. "You've never really tried to fit in here. You've been waiting for an excuse to run back to your simple little life, even if it means leaving your family behind." Sarah felt a flash of anger. "That's not true, and you know it. I've tried to support you to adapt to this new life, but you've changed, Thomas. You've become someone I don't recognize." "I've improved," he corrected sharply. "I've evolved. Maybe that's the real problem. You can't keep up." "Keep up?" Sarah echoed incredulously. "This isn't a race, Thomas. It's our life, our marriage." "Marriage needs to evolve too," he countered. "And if you can't evolve with me..." He let the implication hang in the air. Sarah stared at him, the reality of their situation finally crystallizing. "Are you saying you want a divorce?" For a moment, Thomas's facade cracked, and she glimpsed uncertainty in his eyes, but it vanished as quickly as it had appeared. Maybe that would be best for everyone. The words hung in the air between them, heavy and irreversible. Sarah felt oddly calm, as if she'd been expecting this moment without knowing it. "And Emily?" she asked quietly. "Emily belongs here with the opportunities this life provides," Thomas stated firmly. "The courts would agree that stability and educational advantages are in her best interest." "You would fight me for custody?" Sarah felt her calm beginning to crack. "I would do what's best for our daughter," Thomas replied, his tone making it clear he believed that meant keeping Emily with him in this new world he'd embraced so completely. Sarah's hands trembled as she zipped her suitcase. "I'd like to say goodnight to Emily before I go." Thomas stepped aside, gesturing magnanimously as if granting a great favor. Sarah walked to Emily's room, where her daughter slept peacefully, unaware of the fracture that had just torn through her family. Sarah sat gently on the edge of the bed, smoothing Emily's hair away from her forehead. "I love you more than anything in this world," she whispered, memorizing every detail of her daughter's face. "No matter what happens, never forget that." As she rose to leave, Emily stirred slightly. "Mom," she murmured sleepily. "Go back to sleep, sweetheart," Sarah soothed, her heart breaking. "Everything's fine." But Emily sat up, suddenly more alert. "You're crying, what's wrong?" Sarah tried to smile. "Your dad and I are having a disagreement. I'm going to stay somewhere else for a little while until we work things out." Emily's eyes widened with alarm. "You're leaving, now, in the middle of the night?" "Just for a little while," Sarah assured her, though she no longer believed that herself. Emily scrambled out of bed, suddenly panicked. "No, you can't go. Please don't leave me, Mum." The sound of her daughter's distress brought Thomas to the doorway. "What's going on?" "Mom's leaving," Emily cried, clinging to Sarah's arm. Thomas's expression hardened. "Your mother's making a choice, Emily. She's choosing to walk away from our family." "That's not true," Sarah protested, but Emily was already looking at her with confusion and hurt. "Why can't you just try harder to like it here?" Emily asked, her voice small. "I like my new school. I don't want to leave." "No one's asking you to leave, sweetheart," Thomas said soothingly, coming to sit on Emily's other side. "Your mom is the one who wants to go." Sarah felt trapped between her daughter's pleading eyes and Thomas's manipulative framing. "Emily, this is very complicated." "If you loved us, you wouldn't leave," Emily said, the childish logic cutting straight to Sarah's heart. Thomas looked at Sarah with triumph. In his eyes, he had won this round and he knew it. Sarah couldn't bring herself to leave with Emily's tearful face begging her to stay. "You're right," she finally said, setting her suitcase down. "Let's all get some sleep. We can talk more in the morning." But as Thomas retreated to the guest room, and Emily finally drifted back to sleep, Sarah sat awake, staring out at the city lights. She felt more alone in that moment than she ever had in her life, trapped in a gilded cage with no clear path forward. The next morning brought no resolution, only a tense quiet, as they moved around each other in a carefully choreographed dance of avoidance. After Thomas left for class and Emily for school, Sarah found herself alone in the vast apartment, the silence oppressive. She moved to the window where her jasmine plant struggled to survive despite her care. Its once vibrant leaves had yellowed, yet a single stubborn bud clung to life. "We both need sunshine and open air," she whispered, touching a wilted leaf. In that moment of clarity, Sarah knew she needed to create some breathing room, a space of her own where she could think without Thomas's influence or Emily's pleading eyes. She couldn't leave permanently, not with Emily caught in the middle, but she couldn't continue living as a ghost in her own life either. She packed a small bag with essentials and wrote a note explaining that she needed a few days to clear her head. She assured Emily she would call every night and be back soon. Then, with her jasmine plant carefully wrapped and secured in a tote bag, she left the apartment. With no destination in mind, Sarah found herself on a train heading west out of the city. As Philadelphia's skyline receded and gave way to suburbs and then rolling countryside, she felt herself breathe more deeply. 3 hours later, she stepped off at a stop called New Hope, drawn by the name alone. New Hope was a picturesque river town on the Delaware, filled with artists, small shops, and historic buildings. It reminded her vaguely of Willowbrook in its sense of community, though with a more bohemian energy. Sarah checked into a modest bed and breakfast, using some of the money she'd taken from their joint account, money that had become abundant since the inheritance, but somehow felt more precious now that she was spending it on her own terms. "Just a few nights," she told the proprietor, a gray-haired woman named Martha who looked at her with knowing eyes. "Take all the time you need, honey," Martha replied. "Sometimes a little distance helps clear the fog." Sarah spent that first day walking along the river, her phone turned off, allowing herself to simply exist without demands or expectations. By evening, she felt calm enough to turn it back on. There were 17 missed calls from Thomas, his messages evolving from angry to concerned to coldly formal, and one tearful voicemail from Emily that nearly broke her resolve. She called Emily immediately, assuring her that everything was okay, that she just needed a little time to think, that she loved her more than anything. "Why can't you think here with us?" Emily asked, her voice small. "Sometimes grown-ups need space to sort out complicated feelings," Sarah explained as gently as she could. "But I promise I'll be back soon, and we'll talk about everything then." After hanging up, Sarah sat on the edge of the bed in her quaint room, the jasmine plant positioned by the window to catch the morning sun. For the first time in months, she allowed herself to really feel the weight of what had happened to her life, to their life. The inheritance that had seemed like such a blessing had instead revealed fault lines in their marriage that she hadn't known existed. Or had they always been there, hidden beneath the surface of their simple life in Willowbrook? Had Thomas always harbored ambitions and discontents that found fertile ground in Philadelphia's wealthy soil? The next morning, Martha invited her to join the other guests for breakfast in the garden. Reluctantly at first, then with growing ease, Sarah found herself sharing snippets of her story with this group of strangers: a retired teacher, a young artist couple, and a middle-aged woman traveling alone. "Sounds like your husband's experiencing sudden wealth syndrome," said the retired teacher, Gerald. "I've seen it before. Money changes how people see themselves and others." "It's not just the money," Sarah admitted. "It's like he was always waiting to become this other person, and now he has the chance." "And where does that leave you?" asked Diane, the solo traveler, her eyes kind but direct. The question lingered with Sarah as she spent the day exploring New Hope. She visited local farms and farmers' markets, finding comfort in the familiar sights and smells. At one farm stand, she struck up a conversation with the owner, Claire, who invited her to see the operation. "We supply restaurants in Philadelphia with organic produce," Claire explained, as they walked through neatly tended rows of vegetables. "Started small, but now we can barely keep up with demand." Something stirred in Sarah as she ran her hands through the soil, feeling its richness between her fingers. "I had gardens back in Willowbrook," she confided. "Sometimes I think I miss them more than anything else." Claire studied her thoughtfully. "We're actually looking for help, someone who knows plants, who's reliable. Would be part-time to start, but I'm not sure how long I'll be in the area," Sarah said apologetically. "Well, the offer stands if your plans change," Claire replied. "Sometimes a new beginning starts with getting your hands dirty." That night, Sarah noticed her jasmine plant had perked up slightly, the single bud beginning to unfurl in the fresh country air. She called Emily again, their conversation easier this time, filled with details of school projects and friends, rather than the heaviness of adult troubles. "When to you?" She finally called Thomas. His voice was cool, controlled. "I've consulted a lawyer," he informed her without preamble. "If you're planning to abandon your family, you should know there will be consequences." "I'm not abandoning anyone," Sarah replied, suddenly tired of his manipulations. "I'm taking a few days to think about what I want for my future, for our future if we still have one." "While you're thinking," Thomas continued as if she hadn't spoken, "you might want to consider what a judge would think about a mother who walks out on her child." The threat was clear, and it ignited something in Sarah that had been dormant for too long. And what would a judge think about a father who systematically emotionally abused his wife, who dragged his family away from their support system for his own ambition, then abandoned them emotionally once he got what he wanted? The silence on the other end was telling. Thomas hadn't expected her to fight back. "Be reasonable, Sarah," he finally said, his tone conciliatory now. "Come home, we can work this out." But something had shifted in Sarah. "I'll be back in 3 days, we'll talk then." During those 3 days, Sarah blossomed in ways she hadn't expected. She helped Claire at the farm in the mornings, spent afternoons exploring New Hope's artistic community, and evenings in thoughtful conversation with the B&B guests. Martha introduced her to local business owners and artists who welcomed her into their circles without judgment or expectations. "You've got a natural eye for color and composition," remarked a local weaver after Sarah had helped rearrange her shop display. "Have you ever thought about working in design?" By the time she boarded the train back to Philadelphia, Sarah had a notebook filled with ideas, contacts, and possibilities. Her jasmine plant, secured safely beside her, had sprouted new growth. Most importantly, she had a clarity of purpose that had been missing for months. Thomas was waiting when she returned to the apartment, his expression a careful mask of concern. "Emily's at a friend's for a playdate," he said. "I thought we should talk privately first." Sarah set down her bags and placed the jasmine plant in its spot by the window. "Yes, we should." "I've been thinking about what you said," Thomas began, his tone measured. Maybe I have been focused on my new opportunities to the detriment of our family. I can make some adjustments." "It's more than that, Thomas," Sarah interrupted gently. "This isn't just about your schedule or priorities. It's about who we've become, who you've become, and who I need to be." Thomas frowned. "What does that mean?" "It means I can't be the woman you want me to be," Sarah said, her voice steady. "I tried, Thomas, I really did. But pretending to be someone I'm not is slowly destroying me." "So what? You want to go back to Willowbrook? Back to selling vegetables?" At farmers' markets, his tone was dismissive, reinforcing everything she had come to realize. "No," Sarah replied calmly. "I don't want to go backward, but I need to move forward in a way that honors who I am, not who you think I should be." She told him about New Hope, about Claire's farm, about the connections she'd made. "I've been offered a part-time position, helping manage the farm's Philadelphia restaurant accounts. It's something I understand, food, people, honest work, but it's also something new." Thomas looked genuinely surprised. "You found a job in 3 days?" "I found possibilities," Sarah corrected, "and clarity. I want to make this work for Emily's sake, but things have to change, Thomas. I need my own space, my own identity in this new life. I can't just be your accessory." "What exactly are you proposing?" Thomas asked warily. "I want to rent a small apartment in New Hope. I'll commute to Philadelphia for work and to see Emily. She can stay with me on weekends, holidays, whenever works with her schedule. You can focus on your studies and your career without feeling," well, she hesitated, "burdened by my presence." Thomas leaned back, studying her. "You've really thought this through." "I've had to," Sarah replied simply, "because the alternative was losing myself completely." A complex mixture of emotions crossed Thomas's face: relief, guilt, uncertainty. "And financially. I believe I'm entitled to half of the inheritance," Sarah said firmly, "but I don't need half. I just need enough to establish myself independently. The rest can go toward Emily's future." When Emily returned home later that afternoon and found her mother waiting, her joy was immediate and overwhelming. She flew into Sarah's arms, burying her face against her shoulder. "You came back," she whispered. "I will always come back to you," Sarah promised, holding her tightly. "Always." That night, as Emily slept, Sarah and Thomas hammered out the practical details of their new arrangement. It wasn't a perfect solution, and there were moments when old resentments flared, but beneath it all was a grudging respect for the boundaries Sarah had finally established. As she stood on the balcony later, watching the city lights twinkle against the night sky, Sarah noticed her jasmine plant. In the soft glow from the apartment, she could see that the single bud had fully opened, its delicate white petals unfurled, and its sweet fragrance filling the air with promise. Spring arrived in New Hope, with an explosion of color and possibility. 6 months had passed since Sarah had made the decision to create her own path, and the small riverside apartment she now called home had become a sanctuary. Large windows filled the space with natural light, illuminating walls adorned with local artwork and shelves lined with books on gardening, business, and personal growth. Her jasmine plant, now thriving, had been joined by an assortment of herbs and flowers that transformed her balcony into a miniature garden overlooking the Delaware River. Sarah's work with Claire's farm had expanded beyond the original part-time arrangement. Her intuitive understanding of both farming and people had made her invaluable in building relationships with Philadelphia's top chefs and restaurateurs. 3 days a week, she drove into the city with a van full of organic produce, meeting with chefs who had come to respect her knowledge and authenticity. "When Sarah Miller recommends a vegetable, you listen," Chef Marconi of Riverside Bistro had told a food writer for Philadelphia magazine. "She knows her products like no one else, because she understands the connection between the land and the table." The feature article that followed, Farm to Table Ambassador: How Sarah Miller is Changing Philadelphia's Food Scene, had brought unexpected attention and new opportunities. Several restaurants had approached her about consulting on their seasonal menus, and a community college had invited her to teach a workshop on sustainable food systems. It wasn't just her professional life that had flourished. In New Hope, Sarah had found a community that valued her for exactly who she was. Her apartment building housed artists, writers, and small business owners who regularly gathered for potluck dinners and creative collaborations. Martha from the B&B had become a cherished friend and mentor, introducing Sarah to her extensive network of local entrepreneurs. Every Friday afternoon, Sarah would leave work early to prepare for Emily's arrival. Their weekends together had become sacred time, hiking along the river, helping at the farm, exploring the quirky shops of New Hope, or simply reading together in the cozy window seat that had become Emily's favorite spot. "I like your home, Mum," Emily had said during one of their first weekends together. "It feels like you." The observation, so simple yet profound from her 11-year-old daughter, had brought tears to Sarah's eyes. Emily had adapted to the new arrangement with remarkable resilience, seeming to appreciate having both worlds available to her, the educational and cultural opportunities of Philadelphia with Thomas, and the warmth and creativity of New Hope with Sarah. Thomas, too, had settled into the new normal, though not without challenges. The initial weeks had been tense with passive-aggressive comments and subtle attempts to undermine the custody arrangement. But as he immersed himself more fully in his studies and the academic community, his resistance had gradually faded. "Professor Harrington thinks I have a shot at a prestigious internship this summer," he mentioned during one of their handoffs. "It would mean some evening hours, though. Would you be able to take Emily more often?" "Of course," Sarah had replied, without hesitation or resentment. Their conversations had become primarily practical, centered around Emily's needs and logistics. The emotional charge that had once crackled between them had dissipated, replaced by a cool civility that, while not warm, was at least functional. On this particular Saturday morning in May, Sarah was preparing for a significant event. Claire's Farm was hosting its first farm-to-table festival, bringing together local producers, chefs, and consumers for a day of food, education, and community. Sarah had been instrumental in organizing the festival, leveraging her growing network of connections in both New Hope and Philadelphia. "Mom, do you think Dad will really come?" Emily asked as she helped Sarah arrange flowers for the welcome table. Sarah glanced at her daughter, noting the hope in her eyes. Thomas had reluctantly agreed to attend after Emily's persistent requests, but Sarah wasn't entirely confident. "He would follow through. He said he would try, sweetheart. But remember, he has that big exam on Monday." Emily nodded, her expression a mixture of understanding and disappointment that made Sarah's heart ache. Despite the improvements in their separate lives, she was acutely aware of the emotional toll the separation had taken on their daughter. "He's missing out," Emily said finally, adjusting a sunflower in the arrangement. "This is going to be the best festival ever." Sarah smiled, grateful for her daughter's resilience. "With you as my assistant, how could it not be?" The festival grounds were already buzzing with activity when they arrived. Vendors were setting up colorful stands displaying everything from heirloom tomatoes to artisanal cheeses. A stage had been erected for cooking demonstrations, and children's activities were arranged around a small petting zoo featuring the farm's gentlest animals. "Sarah, thank goodness you're here," Claire called, hurrying over with a clipboard. "The chef from Marigold cancelled at the last minute for the 11 o'clock demo. Do you think you could step in? Just something simple with our spring vegetables." "Me?" Sarah laughed. "Claire, I'm not a chef. But you know our produce better than anyone, and you're wonderful with people," Claire persisted. "Just a simple dish, something anyone could make at home to showcase the flavors." Before Sarah could respond, a familiar voice interrupted. "She'll be amazing." Sarah turned to find James Reynolds standing behind her, his warm smile brightening his weathered face. James owned the land adjacent to Claire's farm and had become an unexpected presence in Sarah's new life. A widower in his early 50s, he had left a successful engineering career in Boston after his wife's illness to return to his family's farmland. Over the past months, he had become one of Sarah's most steadfast supporters, offering practical help and quiet companionship without pressure or expectations. "James," Emily exclaimed, giving him a quick hug, "are you judging the pie contest?" "Wouldn't miss it," he replied, ruffling her hair affectionately before turning back to Sarah. Seriously, you should do the demo. Remember that spring vegetable frittata you made when we got stuck in the rain last month? It was simple but incredible. Sarah felt a blush rise to her cheeks, still unaccustomed to such direct appreciation. That was just throwing together what we had on hand, which is exactly what people need to learn, Claire pointed out, using what's fresh and available. Please, Sarah, you'd be saving the festival. Well, when you put it that way, Sarah laughed, finding it impossible to refuse. Emily, would you be my sous chef? As the festival officially opened and visitors began streaming in, Sarah was too busy to worry about whether Thomas would make an appearance. The cooking demonstration was a surprising success, with people crowding around to watch, as she and Emily prepared a simple spring frittata, using eggs from the farm and vegetables harvested that morning. The secret is to let the vegetables speak for themselves, Sarah explained as she gently sautéed asparagus, spring onions and peas. When something is this fresh, you don't need to overcomplicate it. The crowd seemed genuinely engaged, asking questions and jotting down notes. Sarah found herself relaxing into the role of teacher, sharing not just techniques but her philosophy about food and connection. Cooking isn't just about feeding our bodies, she said, as she slid the frittata into the portable oven. It's about nourishing our connections to the land and to each other. As the demonstration concluded to enthusiastic applause, Sarah looked up to see Thomas standing at the back of the crowd, looking slightly out of place in his designer casual wear, but clapping along with everyone else. Emily spotted him at the same moment and raced over, pulling him by the hand toward the demonstration table. Dad, did you see? Mom taught everyone how to make a frittata, and I helped. I caught the end, Thomas replied, his eyes meeting Sarah's, with an expression she couldn't quite read. You both did great. Thanks for coming, Sarah said simply, meaning it. Whatever their differences, Thomas was making an effort for Emily's sake, and she respected that. Emily's been talking about nothing else. All week, he said with a small shrug. I wanted to see what all the excitement was about. There was an awkward pause, filled with all the things they no longer said to each other, before James approached, offering Thomas his hand. You must be Emily's father. I'm James Reynolds, Claire's neighbor. If Thomas noticed the comfortable familiarity between James and Sarah, he gave no indication. Thomas Miller, he replied, with a polite nod. Nice place you have here. We think so, James said, including Sarah in his smile. Though I can't take credit for what Claire and Sarah have built with the farm-to-restaurant program, it's transforming how Philadelphia thinks about local food. Thomas glanced at Sarah with what might have been surprise or perhaps reassessment. So I've heard. Emily keeps me updated on all of Sarah's projects. The conversation might have lapsed into awkwardness again, but Emily saved them, tugging at both her parents' hands. Come on! I want to show you the baby goats, Dad, and then we can get lunch. Chef Anton is making wood-fired pizzas with Mum's vegetables. As Emily led them through the festival, Sarah was struck by the strange tableau they presented. Not a reunited family, but something new and undefined. Thomas seemed to be seeing her with fresh eyes, observing her easy interactions with vendors and guests, the respect she commanded, the life she had created independent of him. During a moment when Emily was distracted by the goats, Thomas turned to Sarah. You seem different. I am different, Sarah acknowledged. Or maybe I'm finally just being who I always was, but with more confidence. Thomas nodded slowly. It suits you, he admitted. This whole world suits you in a way Philadelphia never did. It's not about the place, Sarah replied gently. It's about having the space to grow in my own direction. They watched Emily in companionable silence for a moment before Thomas spoke again. I'm seeing someone, he said abruptly. A professor. In the economics department. I thought you should hear it from me before Emily mentions it. Sarah absorbed this information, surprised by her lack of pain at the revelation. I hope she makes you happy, Thomas. She challenges me, he replied, and Sarah recognized it as the highest compliment he could give. What about you? And he nodded in the direction of James, who was chatting with Claire near the cider stand. Sarah smiled. James is a good friend, a remarkable man. Beyond that, she shrugged, I'm still figuring out what I want. As the day progressed, Sarah found herself increasingly at ease with the new dynamics. When it was time for Thomas to leave, he did have studying to do after all, there were no recriminations or tension. Emily hugged him goodbye, secure in the knowledge that she would be returning to Philadelphia on Sunday evening, and then happily rejoined Sarah and James for the evening concert. Under twinkling lights strung across the festival grounds, with Emily dozing against her side and James's steady presence beside her, Sarah felt a profound sense of contentment. Her gaze drifted to the rolling fields illuminated by the rising moon, the same moon that shone over Willowbrook and Philadelphia, connecting all the chapters of her journey. A year ago, she could never have imagined this life, not the pain of what she had lost, nor the joy of what she had found. The inheritance that had seemed like the answer to their prayers had indeed changed everything, just not in the ways they had expected. It had stripped away pretenses, revealed truths, and ultimately set them each on authentic paths. James's hand found hers in the darkness, a question in his touch. Sarah's fingers interlaced with his, an answer without words. They had time. There was no need to rush this delicate, budding connection. Like her jasmine plant, it would unfurl in its own season, reaching toward light and warmth. As if reading her thoughts, James leaned closer. Claire mentioned she's thinking of expanding the educational programs at the farm, said you'd be perfect to lead them. Sarah smiled, possibilities unfurling in her mind like new leaves. I might be interested. Just might? James teased gently. Sarah looked around at the community she had helped build, at her peacefully sleeping daughter, at the man beside her who saw her strength rather than seeking to diminish it. Actually, she amended, I think I'd love it. In the soft glow of lantern light, with music drifting across fields ready for new growth, Sarah Miller felt something settle in her soul, a recognition that sometimes the greatest inheritances aren't measured in dollars or possessions, but in the courage to nurture one's true self and allow it to bloom. On Monday morning, as she stood on her balcony watering her thriving garden, Sarah noticed that her jasmine plant, the one small piece of her old life that had survived the journey, was covered in buds ready to burst into fragrant bloom. Like the plant, she had not merely survived transplanting, she had thrived, putting down new roots and reaching toward a sky filled with possibilities all her own. Fin de la Historia. If you enjoyed the journey of Sarah Miller and her transformation from a woman who lost her way to a woman who found her true path, we invite you to join our community of storytellers and dreamers. Every week, we bring you new tales of resilience, growth, and authentic living that will inspire your own journey. Click the subscribe button to your left to ensure you never miss a story, and leave a like if Sarah's courage resonated with you. What part of her journey touched you most deeply? What difficult changes have you navigated in your own life? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your story might be the inspiration someone else needs today. Until our next adventure together, remember that sometimes the most beautiful blooms come from the most unexpected transplantings.